You wouldn't believe what happened to me last winter. Truth is, I'm still not sure I believe it myself, but I've got to tell somebody. Even now, my hands shake just thinking about it. I'm 72 years old, and I've been living alone on this mountain for nearly 15 years. My little cabin sits about 12 miles off an old logging road that most folks don't even realize still exists. The county stopped maintaining it years ago, so it's just me and whoever's gutsy enough to drive a four-wheel up here. Most of the time, the only visitor is the mail carrier once a week, maybe a hunter or two during the season. I moved up here after my husband passed away. The city was just too loud, too full of memories. Out here, the only sounds are the wind through the pines, the stream tumbling over rocks, and sometimes a deer walking across my yard. It suits me fine. I keep a garden, a few chickens, and plenty of firewood for winter, or at least I thought I had enough. That October was strangely warm. I remember thinking how odd it was. Usually by mid-month we've had our first hard frost, but the leaves were still green on some trees and I was still pulling tomatoes off the vine in November. The hens were laying more eggs than usual, almost like they were confused by the long summer weather. The old-timers down in town were warning of a brutal winter. They always say that, but this time it felt different. Every trip into town for supplies came with a warning. Stock up, cut more wood, make sure your roof can hold the snow. The kind of talk you brush off until you realize you shouldn't. I'd weathered plenty of winters here, but something about the air unsettled me. And the animals, they weren't acting right either. The squirrels were frantic, stashing nuts in every nook they could find. Birds that should have flown south weeks earlier were still hanging around like they couldn't decide. Even my chickens stuck close to the coop, squawking more than usual. By late November, I'd chopped and stacked more firewood than I ever had before. My little pickup was packed with root vegetables, canned food, and emergency supplies. I even bought extra feed for the chickens and double-checked that the generator was in good working order. Looking back, it feels like my instincts were telling me this was bigger than just a bad snowstorm. Then the temperature nosedived. On Tuesday, it was still mild enough that I worked outside in just a light jacket. By Wednesday morning, the water buckets were frozen solid, and the weather radio was warning about an unusual storm system forming out west, the kind they track and name like a hurricane. December hit us like a hammer. By the third week, we'd already had more snowfall than most whole winters. The forecasters kept talking about a once-in-a-decade blizzard pushing in from the west. I'd been through ugly weather before, so I went through the motions, checked supplies, stacked wood by the door, made sure the chicken coop was reinforced. But this time the feeling was different. The air pressure dropped so fast it made my ears ring. The wind shifted from a direction that usually means tornado weather, not snow. The hens quit laying altogether and huddled in the corner of their coop. Even my old bones ached in ways I'd never felt. The first flakes fell Monday night, hard little pellets of ice more than snow. By Tuesday morning, we had 6 inches of the driest, powdery snow I'd ever seen. It didn't pack down at all, just blew around like sand. The wind never let up, not fierce yet, just constant, keeping the air filled with drifting white and cutting visibility to almost nothing. I spent that whole Tuesday double-checking everything. The hens had food and water, though they seemed jumpy. The wood pile was covered and close at hand. Every window was boarded tight. I hauled in extra kerosene for the lamps. The generator was primed and ready, though I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. That night, the real storm hit. I remember because I'd had the radio on, and they were still speculating that the system might shift course. But by 8 o'clock, the wind picked up, and by 9, I could barely see the chicken truck from my kitchen window. The change was unbelievable. What had been a steady, manageable breeze turned violent in minutes. The house creaked in ways I'd never heard, and the snow started hammering the windows so hard it sounded like someone pitching gravel at the glass. By 10 o'clock that night, I couldn't even see the porch light from inside my own house. The snow wasn't falling straight anymore. It was blasting sideways, driven by winds gusting over 60 miles an hour. Trees that had stood for decades bent like weeds, and every so often I'd hear the sharp crack of one splitting somewhere out in the dark. Those snaps cut right through the howl of the wind. The temperature was dropping like a rock. My thermometer went from the upper 60s at sunset to below freezing by midnight, and it just kept plunging. Even with the fire roaring and every lamp burning, the house was getting colder. I could feel the heat being sucked right out through the walls. No matter how much wood I fed the stove, by midnight I knew something was different this time. The wind wasn't just howling anymore, it was screaming. The snow came down so thick it looked like a solid white wall just outside my windows. The temperature kept dropping so fast I could feel the chill bleeding right through the walls, even as the fire burned. The power went out around 2 a.m. That wasn't unusual in these parts, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I had plenty of candles and kerosene lamps, but without the backup heater, the house cooled fast. I threw another log on the fire and tried to catch some sleep, but the noise was unbearable. Trees cracked like rifle shots, and something kept thumping against the outside walls. There was no sleeping through that racket. Every few minutes, another crash rolled through the woods, another tree down, echoing through the mountains like thunder. The wind was so fierce I could hardly think, and the whole house shuddered with every gust. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a sound that didn't fit. A steady, rhythmic pounding on the back wall of the house, even too deliberate to be just storm debris. I grabbed a flashlight and checked every window I could reach, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see a thing. The pounding went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped just as suddenly as it started. By dawn, the storm was still raging, but it had settled into a strange pattern. The wind would howl for 10 or 15 minutes, then fade almost to silence, only to come back stronger. In those brief lulls, I could hear the snow and ice shifting, the sound of an entire landscape being remade. I tried the door during one of those quiet spells and looked out into a world I didn't recognize. The snow was already 3 feet deep and still coming down hard. My truck was buried completely, just a white mound where I knew it had been. The path to the chicken coop was gone, and even the coop itself was half buried. The hens were still alive. I could hear them clucking nervously inside, but there was no way I could reach them safely until the storm let up. At least the coop was sturdy and well insulated. They'd be cold and scared, but they'd make it. Wednesday turned out worse than Tuesday night. The storm had built all through the dark hours, and now the snow came down so fast I couldn't even see my hand when I held it out in front of me. The wind no longer gave me those little breaks. It was just one long, unending roar that rattled the cabin down to its bones. I spent the day feeding the fire and checking for leaks or damage. The roof still held, but I could hear ice piling thick in the gutters. A few windows had frost on the inside glass, even with the stove going full tilt. The cold was seeping in, steady and merciless. Around noon, the pounding started again. This time it was on the front of the house, near the door. The same steady rhythm, like something or someone was trying to force its way inside. I peered out through the window, but there was nothing to see but swirling snow. The sound went on for hours, sometimes stopping for a spell, only to start again from another spot on the wall. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a moose, desperate for shelter. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. The pounding was too measured, too intentional, like something was testing the cabin, probing for a weakness. By evening, I was starting to worry about supplies. I'd been burning through wood faster than I had planned, and the lamps were eating kerosene quicker than usual. If this storm dragged on, I'd have to start rationing heat. The pounding finally stopped at dusk, but by then I was too wound up to rest. Every creak of the house set me on edge. Every gust sounded like footsteps on the roof. I kept checking the locks, even though I knew no human being could be out there in that weather. That Wednesday night felt less like survival and more like endurance, just hanging on against something bigger than I could understand. The storm had been raging for over 24 hours with no sign of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. The wind howled so loud I couldn't even hear myself think, and the cold pressed through every crack and seam of the cabin. I dragged my mattress into the main room near the stove and tried to sleep there. It was warmer than the bedroom, but still cold enough that I piled on every blanket I owned. The fire had to be fed every hour, which meant I never slept more than 40 or 50 minutes at a stretch. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something that froze me to the core. A cry. Not the wind, not branches scraping against the walls, an actual cry, thin and haunting, like a child's voice but deeper, carrying a strange, echoing resonance. At first I thought the storm was playing tricks on my ears, but the sound didn't stop, even during those rare moments when the wind fell silent. It seemed to come from just outside the cabin, faint but steady. It rose and fell like the call of a young whale, but there was no mistaking the raw ache in it. My first thought was a stray cat or some wild animal, but I had never heard anything cry like that before. I tried to ignore it, tried to get some sleep, but the sound gnawed at me. There was something inside it that went straight through my chest and clenched my heart. It wasn't just the cry of an animal in distress. It was the sound of something small, helpless, and terrified. That second night was worse than the first. The storm still refused to stop. I made my rounds, checked the fire, checked the windows, made sure nothing was leaking, and had just settled back down when I heard it again. Louder this time, clear, close. And it wasn't just one voice anymore. There were two. Distinct, young, keening in pain. Whatever they were, the feelings behind those cries were unmistakable. Fear, cold, desperation. I had raised 3 kids, helped care for more grandkids than I can count. The instinct to answer a child's cry was too strong to ignore. My head told me to stay inside, but my heart wouldn't let me. I grabbed my flashlight and my thickest coat. The blast of cold when I opened the door hit me like a physical blow. The wind nearly tore the light out of my hand. Snow clawed at my mouth and nose until it felt like I couldn't breathe. But the crying was louder now, coming from the side of the house where the foundation met the ground. I stumbled toward it, leaning into the gale, sometimes grabbing onto the cabin wall to keep from going down. Snow was waist deep in most places, higher where the drifts had piled. Step by step, I followed the sound until my flashlight beam landed on something dark huddled against the stone footing. At first I thought it was just a tangle of branches blown in by the storm. Then it moved. My breath caught in my throat. There were 2 of them. Small, no bigger than a 3-year-old child, but wrong somehow. Their limbs too long, their torsos too broad. They were covered in dark brown fur, stiff and rimmed with ice crystals, but it was their faces that made my stomach turn. Not quite human, not quite animal, something caught in between. The bone structure looked closer to human than ape, but the proportions were off. Wide eye sockets, heavy brows, flat noses, and those eyes. Huge, black, and glistening. When they looked up at me, I saw intelligence there, not the kind you see in an animal, but something deeper, more complicated. And they were dying. I could see it at once. Their breaths came shallow and ragged, their bodies shivering so violently they could barely hold themselves upright. Ice crusted their fur, their lashes, even around their nostrils. Whatever they were infants of their kind, just babies, freezing to death on my doorstep. I didn't think about what they might be or whether they could be dangerous. All I saw were 2 tiny creatures, helpless and desperate for help. That maternal instinct inside me pushed harder than any fear or confusion about what I was seeing. I slipped off my heavy coat and wrapped it around both of them as best I could. They didn't resist, didn't try to get away. If anything, they seemed to understand I was trying to help. They whimpered softly and pressed closer to the warmth. Their tiny hands, yes, hands, with opposable thumbs and distinct fingers clutched at my clothes. They were heavier than I expected, dense and solid like well-fed children, but I managed to lift them both. One had a noticeably smaller hand than the other, maybe a year younger, and it seemed weaker. The older one made soft sounds toward the smaller one, almost like it was trying to reassure it. Getting them back inside was a struggle. The wind knocked me sideways, snow blinded me, and with both arms full and the flashlight jammed under my arm, I could barely keep my footing. More than once, I had to feel my way along the cabin wall just to make sure I was heading in the right direction. When I finally stumbled through the door into the warmth of the cabin, the difference was overwhelming. The creatures felt it too. At first, the shock of warm air made them shiver even harder, like their bodies didn't know how to handle the sudden change. But little by little, the trembling eased. I set them down in front of the stove and covered them with every blanket I could find. Their fur was so cold it felt like touching stone, and they shook violently enough that I worried about seizures. Ice clung to their coats, their lashes, even around their noses and mouths. I stoked the fire high and moved them as close as I dared without risking burns. They seemed to know what fire was. They didn't try to touch it, but they pressed as close as they could, stretching their hands toward the heat. And those hands, God help me, were both fascinating and terrifying. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. The fingers were longer than ours, with an extra joint that let them bend in ways mine never could. Their thumbs sat lower, giving them a grip that looked both powerful and precise. I warmed some milk on the wood stove, testing it carefully to make sure it wasn't too hot. When I held it out, they looked at the cup with startling intelligence, as if they understood my intent but weren't sure if they could trust me. The older one reached first, hesitating, tapping the rim as though testing the temperature. Then it lifted the cup with both hands and drank slowly, those huge black eyes never leaving mine over the rim. The smaller one was reluctant, glancing between me and its companion. You could see it wanted warmth and food, but was too afraid to accept. The older one made a soft, coaxing sound, gentle, encouraging. Finally, the little one took its own cup and drank. I gave them small pieces of bread and some leftover soup I warmed on the stove. They ate with surprising care, examining each bite before tasting it. There was nothing frantic or greedy about them. They seemed to understand the concept of sharing. What struck me most was how they communicated with each other, soft, deliberate sounds that weren't words, but clearly carried meaning. The older one made sure the smaller was fed first, kept it close to the fire, touched it gently whenever it seemed frightened. All the while, they never stopped watching me. Not with aggression, not with fear exactly, but with deep curiosity. They studied me as intently as I studied them, trying to decide what I was and whether I meant them harm. When their bellies were finally full, they huddled together by the fire. The smaller one drifted off to sleep, curled up against its companion. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the stove, feeding the fire, watching their little chests rise and fall. A part of me was afraid of what they were, where they came from, what it might mean, but mostly, I just felt protective. They were children. Whatever else they might be, they were two small, helpless children who needed me. They were so small, so fragile, nearly gone when I found them. By morning, though, they were different. The shivering had stopped. Their fur was dry now, puffed out, making them look bigger, sturdier, more alive. Their eyes were clearer, and they moved with a new curiosity about the cabin. The older one stood up and began to explore, cautious but deliberate, touching everything within reach. It seemed especially fascinated with my books, running those long fingers across the covers, opening a few, studying the marks on the paper as if it understood they meant something. The younger one stayed near the fire, but watched every move its companion made. When the older one found a small hand mirror on my dresser, both of them were entranced. They tapped gently at their reflections, then looked behind the glass as if trying to figure out where the image had come from. The intelligence was undeniable. These weren't just clever animals, they were thinkers, problem solvers. They studied, tested, and reasoned, not merely reacting by instinct. By mid-morning, their sounds had changed. Softer, almost melodic, directed toward me. It took me a while to realize they were trying to express gratitude. The older one would point to itself, then to its smaller companion, then to me, making gentle sounds each time. I spoke back softly, calmly, and they seemed to like the rhythm of human speech. They cocked their heads, listening, sometimes replying with little murmurs as if joining the conversation. Outside, the storm raged for 2 more days. The wind never fully stopped, and the snow kept falling harder than I had ever seen. By Thursday morning, the chicken coop was gone under nearly 8 feet of snow. Strangely, the little ones had adapted to cabin life as though they'd always belonged. They brought me sticks from the woodpile, seemed to understand the fire had to be fed, and they guarded it with as much care as I did. When I cooked, they hovered nearby, watching every step. When I read, they sat quietly, listening to my voice, sometimes making soft sounds as though asking questions. The younger one was shy but affectionate. It would sit close beside me while I worked, occasionally touching my hand or arm with a feather-light gesture. The older one was bolder, endlessly curious, always testing, always learning. By the second day, they grasped the basics. Wood makes the fire burn brighter. Fire makes heat. Heat keeps us alive. They understood that some tones in my voice meant I was pleased, others meant caution. Most surprising of all, they began to help without being asked. If I struggled to reach something, one of them fetched it. If I had a task that took 2 hands, one would step in. Their care for each other was just as remarkable. The older constantly checked on the younger, making sure it was warm, fed, and close by. The smaller leaned on its companion for reassurance, but also showed a stubborn independence for something so young. By Thursday night, their presence no longer felt strange. It felt natural. They had woven themselves into the rhythm of the cabin, bringing more comfort than fear. In the evenings, when I sat by the fire with a book, they curled up close. The smaller one often fell asleep on my legs, while the older listened intently to my voice. Friday morning came with a silence I hadn't heard in days. The storm wasn't gone, but the wind had eased enough that other sounds returned, snow settling, branches cracking, a bird singing faintly somewhere, alive against all odds. The creatures sensed it instantly. They rushed to the window, staring out at the white world, then back at me, then toward the door. For the first time since I'd taken them in, they seemed restless, almost agitated. Wrapped in blankets, I stepped outside to see the damage myself. The world had been remade. Snowdrifts towered above my head. Familiar landmarks were buried or unrecognizable. Trees I had lived alongside for years were downed and broken. The trails I knew by heart were gone. The little ones followed me to the door, but they wouldn't step outside. They stood in the threshold, sniffing the air, trading low sounds between them that were different from anything I'd heard before. There was an urgency in the way they acted that set me on edge, though I couldn't explain why. The chickens were alive, though cold and battered. Their water was frozen solid, and they'd eaten nearly through their feed. It took me an hour of digging to reach them, clearing snow and making sure they had food and fresh water. All the while, the two small creatures hovered in the doorway, watching me with anxious eyes. That was when I saw the tracks. They were massive, at least 150 feet long from start to finish, each print easily 5 or 6 feet apart, 20 feet across at the widest point of the path. They looked vaguely human, but the toes were too long, tipped with what looked like claw marks. Whatever had made them was powerful, much taller than any man. The prints looped around my cabin more than once, pressed deep into the snow, then disappeared back into the forest. They were fresh, laid down after the snow stopped, but before I'd stepped outside. Something huge had circled my home while I slept. My eyes followed the trail deep into the woods, perfectly straight, no wandering. Whoever or whatever left them knew exactly where it was going, exactly what it was looking for. The prints led right up to the wall of my cabin, beneath the windows, then around to the very spot where I'd found the two small ones. From there, they circled the cabin twice before vanishing into the trees. My pulse quickened as the meaning settled in. These weren't random tracks. They belonged to kin parents, siblings, maybe an entire group searching for their missing young. They had found where their children had taken refuge. They had confirmed the little ones were alive. And then they had withdrawn, waiting. I looked back toward the doorway. Two small faces stared at me, making strange, trembling sounds, not cries, not calls, but something caught in between. Their bodies were taut with anticipation, their gaze fixed on the tree line where the tracks disappeared. For the first time, the older one stepped out into the snow. It moved carefully but with purpose, stopping a few yards from the cabin. Then it lifted its head and let out a call unlike anything I'd heard from them before, louder, fuller, echoing across the frozen silence. An answer came at once. Deep, resonant, powerful, the sound rolled through the woods like a foghorn, coming from more than one direction, as if voices were calling back from all around me. The smaller one bounded out beside its companion, both of them answering with shrill, excited tones. It hit me then they were speaking to their family, telling them they were alive, explaining what had happened. The voices in the forest grew louder, multiplying, weaving together in a strange, layered chorus. Some tones were low and commanding, others lighter, youthful, like teenagers or children. Then the woods stirred. Branches snapped. Snow cascaded from the pines as enormous bodies pressed through. And then I saw it, the first adult. It stepped from behind a massive spruce, maybe 50 yards away. Even at that distance, its size was staggering. 8 feet tall, at least, shoulders as broad as a door frame, its body covered in the same dark brown fur as the little ones, but there was nothing childish about it. It stood still as stone, staring at me, measuring me with eyes full of intelligence. I felt weighed, judged its gaze piercing straight through me. The little ones cried out with joy and bolted toward it, but the adult raised a massive hand, and they froze in place instantly. More figures emerged, one after another, until the tree line seemed alive with movement. I lost count after a dozen, but I knew there were more. They spread into a wide arc, forming a loose ring around my cabin. It wasn't random. It was coordinated, tactical, a show of both strength and control. Then the largest appeared, bigger than all the rest. Nearly 9 feet tall, scarred across chest and arms, the kind of scars that spoke of a long, violent life. Its eyes were as dark as the children's, but its face carried none of their gentleness. This was a leader. It stepped forward slowly, deliberately, never taking its gaze off me. Every move was calculated, restrained, but I could feel the readiness behind it, prepared to react to the smallest hint of threat. The others held their line in silence, snow swirling between them. When the leader was within 20 feet, it stopped. The world was utterly still. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I will never forget. A low, resonant sound rolled out not from the throat, but from deep within the chest. It wasn't quite a growl, but it carried authority and raw power all the same. The two young ones reacted instantly, stepping between me and their leader. They began chattering in quick, excited tones, gesturing toward me, toward the cabin, toward themselves. And then I understood they were telling their story. They were explaining how they'd been trapped in the storm, how I'd found them and brought them inside, how I had fed them and kept them warm. The leader listened in silence, its dark gaze never leaving my face. I could see it working through the information, weighing the bond between its children and the strange human who had sheltered them. The others drifted closer as the little one spoke, near enough that I could see the intelligence shining in their eyes. The resemblance to the youngsters was undeniable. Some were clearly female, smaller and more delicate in build, their features finer. Others were unmistakably male, larger, muscled, their presence commanding. What struck me most was how human they all seemed, despite their inhuman forms. They stood upright as naturally as we do. They gestured with their hands when they communicated. Their faces registered emotion in ways I could easily read. This wasn't a band of wild beasts. This was a family, complete with all the bonds and subtle dynamics that word implies. The leader's eyes stayed fixed on me even after the young ones finished. It glanced between them and me, back and forth, considering. Then something extraordinary happened. The older of the two youngsters, the bolder one all along, ran to me, grasped my hand, and tugged me forward. It pointed towards leader and made a soft, melodic call. I knew what it was doing. It was introducing me, vouching for me, declaring I was a friend, not a threat. The younger one joined in, taking my other hand, adding its own voice to the plea. The leader's expression shifted. The hardness didn't vanish, but it blended with something else, something like respect, maybe even gratitude. Its eyes swept over the little ones alive, unharmed, healthy, despite their ordeal, then returned to me. Slowly, deliberately, the massive creature lowered its head. It wasn't a bow, not exactly, but it was unmistakably a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, an admission that I had helped when their young most needed it. One by one, every adult in the group followed suit. Dozens of massive heads dipped in unison, a moment of recognition that cut across the barrier between our species. It was the deepest kind of wordless communication I have ever known. When it was over, the leader straightened and called softly but firmly to its young. They hesitated, glancing back at me with obvious reluctance, their voices carrying tones that sounded almost apologetic. I dropped to my knees in the snow as they approached for a final moment. The smaller pressed close to me, releasing a gentle sound that could only be described as affectionate. The older reached up and brushed my face with one long hand, then made a string of complex, lilting notes that carried the weight of a thank you in any language. I spoke to them the best I could, telling them it had been my privilege, not my burden, to care for them. I doubt they understood my words, but I believe they understood the tone, the intent. They each touched my hand one last time, then turned toward the forest. The leader gave a single call, and instantly the group moved as one. The children clung close to their kin, though they kept looking back at me, again and again, until the trees swallowed them whole. In just minutes, they were gone. The forest had taken them back as if they had never been there at all. If not for the tracks stamped deep in the snow and the memories etched even deeper in my mind, I might have convinced myself it had all been a dream. The silence afterward was deafening. For 4 days, my cabin had been filled with soft sounds, small movements, the constant presence of lives learning, growing, communicating. Now, there was nothing. Just me. The emptiness pressed down heavy. I busied myself with chores, but my thoughts never strayed far from what I had lived through. The cabin felt cavernous without those little guests. I kept catching myself listening for their small voices, or half expecting to see them carry in sticks for the fire. That night, sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying everything, from the moment I found them near death in the snow to the moment they vanished into the woods with their family. Had it really happened? Part of me argued it must have been some kind of hallucination, the product of isolation and exhaustion after the storm. But the evidence was too plain to deny. The blankets they'd used still carried a strange, wild scent unlike anything I'd ever known. The cups they had drunk from still sat clean and waiting where I'd left them. And most telling of all, their footprints remained in the snow around my home alongside the massive tracks of their kin. I knew I had been changed by the experience in ways I was only beginning to grasp. For 4 days, I had carried the weight of responsibility for 2 fragile lives who depended on me completely. In that short span, I had felt protection, motherhood, connection, things I hadn't known since my own children were small. In the days that followed, I found myself searching constantly for signs of my unexpected visitors. Every so often, I thought I caught a flicker of movement among the trees in the distance, but I could never be sure whether it was really them or just shadows and wishful thinking. Little things around the homestead began to change in ways that made me wonder. My woodpile, which I'd left stacked haphazardly, started looking neater each time I went out for firewood. Fallen branches that had blocked the path were mysteriously cleared away, though I hadn't touched them. Most striking of all, small gifts began to appear at the edges of my property. Smooth stones arranged in patterns, bundles of dried berries, strips of bark with natural markings that almost looked deliberate. They always showed up overnight, placed exactly where I would notice them in my daily routine. I started leaving little offerings of my own bits of bread, fruit from the pantry, sometimes small tools or shiny objects I thought might interest them. By morning, the things I left were always gone. Of course, it could have been any animal out there, but deep down, I knew better. The feeling wasn't frightening. If anything, it felt protective, like something was watching over me, the way I had once watched over their young during the storm. As winter gave way to spring, the signs of their presence only grew. Wildflowers began to appear in my garden in patterns too intricate to be natural. My vegetable starts, usually vulnerable to late frosts, were mysteriously shielded by pine boughs I hadn't placed there. One night, the chicken coop damaged badly in the storm was repaired in a way I didn't recognize, with materials and craftsmanship not my own. Slowly, I began to realize I was no longer alone on this mountain. I was part of a larger community, neighbors I would never meet in the daylight, but who were always watching. That thought should have unsettled me. Instead, it gave me comfort. Summer brought subtler signs. The trails I hiked through the forest were kept clear of fallen branches and debris. Dangerous washouts that could have tripped me up were marked with carefully placed stones or sticks. It was as if someone was maintaining the mountain itself for my safety and ease. The offerings continued too, changing with the seasons, bundles of fruits and edible plants in summer, carefully cleaned and sorted nuts and seeds in the fall, always presented with care, always unmistakably intentional. I found myself spending more time outdoors, not just hoping for a glimpse of my hidden neighbors, but because the woods felt safer and more welcoming than ever before. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch and sometimes hear faint sounds from the forest. Not exactly voices, not quite random forest noise either. It might have been conversation, it might have been song. Even my chickens seemed braver. They wandered farther from their coop than they ever had, as if they sensed the protection lingering in the trees. That summer, I didn't lose a single bird to foxes or hawks, though both were seen in the area often. When December came around again, I couldn't stop thinking about the anniversary of that night, the night I found 2 tiny lives freezing in the snow. A full year had passed since the blizzard that changed everything. This winter was mild by comparison, the snowfall steady but never overwhelming. A part of me was almost disappointed. Some part of me had been hoping for another chance, another opportunity to prove that human beings could be trusted. On the exact night of the anniversary, I heard it. Familiar sounds outside the cabin. Not cries this time, but gentle calls I recognized immediately. My heart skipped. I looked out the window and saw fresh prints in the new snow, smaller than the great tracks I'd seen before. I pulled on my coat and followed the trail to the edge of the clearing. There, faint in the moonlight, stood 2 figures by the base of a tree. Taller now, lankier, no longer the tiny, helpless children I had carried in my arms. They were adolescents, nearly grown, but I knew them. It was the same pair I had saved. They didn't come closer. They just stood there a few minutes, calling softly now and then, as if to greet me, to let me know they were well, and that they hadn't forgotten. I called out softly, thanking them for coming, telling them how glad I was to see them again. They seemed to understand my tone, even if they couldn't make sense of my words. One of them, the smaller one from the year before, I was sure raised a hand in what looked very much like a wave. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they slipped back into the forest, leaving behind only their tracks in the snow and my boundless gratitude for the brief reunion. That visit became a tradition of sorts. Each winter, usually right around the anniversary of our first meeting, I would receive some kind of sign that they still remembered. Sometimes it was footprints in the snow, sometimes a faint call from the woods. Once, I found a pile of pine cones neatly arranged on my porch, as if someone had clumsily tried to spell something out. Their protective presence never left me. I endured several more harsh winters and lean summers, but I never truly felt alone or unsafe again. Food stores that should have run out were somehow replenished with wild offerings. Hazards around my property were marked or cleared before I stumbled across them. Even my water pipes, which should have frozen solid during bitter cold snaps, somehow never did. Over time, I came to understand that what I had experienced wasn't a chance encounter. It was a kind of adoption. By saving their children, I had become part of their extended family. The rules and responsibilities that bound them to one another now included me. That understanding brought comfort, but also responsibility. I never took advantage of the protection I'd been given. I avoided needless risks. I never behaved in ways that might endanger my unseen guardians. And I continued to give back in whatever small ways I could: food, simple tools, bright trinkets I thought might be useful or pleasing to them. Soon, though, I'll have to pack up the few belongings I still keep and leave this mountain for the last time. My body needs more care than I can manage out here alone. A small apartment in town will be easier, safer, but it won't be home. The life I've lived here, the bond we've shared, has been the greatest privilege of my years. To be trusted by beings who had every reason to fear and avoid humanity. To be accepted by a species, not my own, as family. I cannot imagine a greater honor. That's all I can truly say about it. Take it as you will. But if you ever find yourself alone in the wild and hear a cry for help, I hope you'll remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do the right thing, even while you're afraid. Here begins the horror story of Bigfoot and the three hunters. I've never been the kind of guy who believes in monsters. For heaven's sake, I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years. And the worst I ever worried about was a black bear, or maybe getting turned around in a whiteout. But what happened to me and my buddies last November changed that forever. I'm telling this story because folks need to know what's really going on out in the deep woods. The official report said it was a bear attack, but bears don't plan things out. Bears don't hunt people like prey, and they sure as hell don't drag you off and stash you in a den. There were 3 of us, me, Ken, and Bobby. We'd been hunting together every season for 8 years. We weren't trophy hunters or anything fancy. Just 3 guys looking to get away from the wives for a long weekend, drink some beer around a fire, and maybe, if luck was on our side, bring home a deer or 2. Ken was the tracker. That man could follow a deer trail across bare rock if you gave him enough time. Bobby was the camp cook and quartermaster. He always packed enough food for an army and somehow remembered everything we forgot: spare batteries, the first aid kit, all the little things that kept us from freezing or starving. That fall, we chose a spot about 12 miles outside Menanguilla National Forest, way farther in than most hunters ever go. The area was thick with oak and maple, prime deer habitat, and far enough off the main trails that we didn't have to worry about weekend warriors shooting at anything that moved. Ken had scouted the place in the spring and found plenty of rubs, old game trails leading down to water, even claw marks on trees. By Friday morning, we were bouncing along in Ken's pickup on rutted Forest Service roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper we went. Finally, the road ended at a little clearing. We loaded our gear onto our backs and hiked another 3 miles to the campsite. It was a fine spot, a flat stretch by a creek, tucked in under big trees with a clear line of sight in case anything wandered close. Setting up camp took most of the afternoon. We pitched our pup tents in a triangle around the fire pit, hung the food high to keep the bears away, and checked our radios. The weather was perfect, crisp, clear, barely a breeze. Ken picked up fresh deer sign within 100 yards of camp, so our hopes were high. That first night went just the way we liked it. Bobby grilled up some steaks, we cracked open a few beers, and made plans for the morning. Ken wanted to work the North Ridge, where he'd seen the most sign. Bobby and I would follow the creek downstream to a meadow about a mile away. We'd all meet back at camp by noon. Around midnight, I crawled out of my tent to take a leak. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead quiet except for the soft trickle of the creek. I walked maybe 20 feet into the trees when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a hog grunting but deeper, heavier. It came from across the creek, maybe 50 yards out. I froze, listening. After a minute, the sound stopped. Bears can make some strange noises, I told myself, shook it off, and went back to bed. We were up before dawn, making coffee on the camp stove while we loaded rifles and checked our packs. The morning air was so cold our breath came out in clouds, but once we got moving, we warmed up quick. Ken headed up the ridge while Bobby and I stuck to the creek. The plan was simple: move slow, glass the clearings, and try to see something before it saw us. For the first few hours, everything went by the book. We found plenty of deer sign tracks in the mud along the banks, fresh droppings, young trees browsed down. Around 10 o'clock, Bobby even spotted a buck, but it was too small and too far for a clean shot, so we let it walk. By noon, we were on our way back when Bobby suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring down at the mud by the water's edge. I caught up, looked where he was pointing, and my stomach dropped. There, pressed into the soft ground, was a footprint, clear as day. But it wasn't a deer's, and it damn sure wasn't a bear's or anything else I'd ever seen. The print was huge, 18 inches long, at least 8 wide, 5 distinct toes. It looked almost human, but whose foot on earth could be that big? The toes were thick, spread wide like something used to walking barefoot on rough ground, and the impression was deep, like whatever left it was, carrying massive weight. Bobby crouched down, set his boot beside it for scale. His size, 11 seconds, looked like a child's shoe next to that print. We scanned the area and found 2 more prints leading out of the creek into the brush. They were spaced as if whatever made them took strides far longer than any man I'd ever seen. We snapped a few photos with Bobby's phone and marked the spot with bright orange tape. When we got back to camp, Ken was there, cleaning a beautiful 6-point buck he'd taken that morning. We showed him the pictures. His face went from proud to puzzled in a heartbeat. Ken's been hunting longer than both of us put together. He's seen every sign these mountains can give you. He studied the photos for a few minutes, shook his head, and told us he'd never come across anything like it. The rest of the afternoon was spent trying to figure out what could leave a footprint that size. The only close comparison we could come up with was a bear walking upright on its hind legs, but bear prints don't show 5 distinct toes like that. That second night felt different. Maybe it was the strange tracks, maybe it was because the woods seemed quieter than usual, but none of us slept well. I kept waking at every little noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. The sounds kept coming through the night, only louder and clearer than normal. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that low, mournful sound again, the same one from the night before, but this time much closer. It seemed to come from just beyond the dying ring of our campfire. I grabbed a flashlight and my rifle and stepped out of the tent. Bobby and Ken were awake too. I could see their beams sweeping around the tents. I called softly to make sure they were up. Ken answered, his voice tight and low. He'd been hearing something moving around our camp for the past hour, always keeping just beyond the reach of the light. We spent the next 20 minutes listening and watching, but whatever it was went completely quiet. The next morning, we found more prints. Something had walked a deliberate circle around our camp during the night, about 30 yards out. The marks matched the ones down by the creek, huge, 5-toed, deeply impressed. Whatever left them was heavy, and it walked with purpose. On Sunday, we broke camp and moved deeper into the valley. Ken was convinced we were being watched and wanted to put some distance between us and whatever was leaving prints. We hiked about 3 kilometers downstream to a bend where the creek wrapped tight against a steep hillside. The new spot was more remote than the first, but somehow felt safer. We could see anyone approaching from 3 different directions. We spent the morning hunting, but none of us were into it. The weekend excitement had been replaced by a constant unease, like we weren't alone in those woods. Every shadow made us pause and scan. Every bird call made one of us reach for a rifle. Around midday, Ken found something that turned our unease into plain fear. About a quarter mile from the new camp, he found what looked like a shelter. A crude lean-to had been constructed from broken branches and rotten logs, big enough to hold something the size of what we were tracking, and it looked recently used. The ground around it was compacted, and scattered nearby were bits of bone, mostly deer, but some smaller fragments too. The stench hit us hard, rotting meat mixed with something wild and musky that made our eyes water. Ken took a few photos and backed away slowly. When he came back and showed us what he'd found, we all agreed it was time to quit. We packed up and started out. As we broke camp, noises began to appear at first, just a slow, irregular knocking, like something thumping against trees in a rhythm, tap, 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 then silence, then tap, tap from another direction. Ken said he'd heard this before. Some hunters claim Bigfoot uses wood knocks to communicate over distance. As we stuffed gear into our packs, the knocking got closer and more frequent. Soon it was all around us, north, south, east, and west, like we were being circled. Bobby suggested we try answering back, banging sticks on trees ourselves to show we weren't afraid. Ken and I both told Bobby that answering back was a terrible idea. By the time we had everything packed into the truck and were ready to roll, the knocking had stopped. The forest had gone dead quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even the whisper of wind through the treetops. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring and the hair stand up on my neck. We started hiking back toward the truck, moving as fast as we could with our heavy packs. About 20 minutes in, the first howl ripped through the valley behind us, coming from the direction of our old campsite. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not human, not animal, but something that froze me to the marrow. The sound echoed through the canyon walls like it would never end. Then another howl answered, this one off to our left on the mountainside. A third followed from the right. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. They were calling to each other, communicating, surrounding us. Ken took point. Bobby limped along at the back, and I stayed in the middle. We pushed harder, breaking into a trot whenever the terrain allowed. Every few minutes, another call rose up, always from a new direction, always closer. It became painfully clear. We weren't just being followed, we were being herded. About an hour into that forced march, we crested a small rise when Ken suddenly dropped to a knee and threw up a fist, signaling us to stop. He pointed toward a cluster of rocks maybe 50 yards ahead. At first, I didn't see a thing. Then one of the shadows moved. It stood there, massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark brown hair. Upright like a man, but built like a gorilla, with arms that dangled nearly to its knees and shoulders so broad it looked like it could flip a truck. The thing didn't flinch, didn't hide. It just stood there, watching us. For what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds, we locked eyes. Then it let out a roar that shook the trees and began to move forward, not charging, not rushing, just walking like it knew damn well we couldn't outrun it and wasn't in a hurry. We bolted, all 3 of us, crashing through brush, branches tearing at our clothes and packs. Behind us, we could hear its heavy footfalls and the sound of small trees snapping aside like weeds. We ran flat out for maybe 10 minutes before Bobby tripped and went down hard. His ankle twisted, and when Ken and I turned back to grab him, that's when we saw them. 3 figures, moving through the trees in a line as if they were driving us somewhere on purpose. They weren't wandering aimlessly, they were coordinated, like hunters. Bobby could barely stand, so Ken and I hauled him up under his arms, half carrying, half dragging him toward a steep hillside where we thought we might shake them. But the creatures followed, keeping a steady pace, never closing the gap, never falling back, just pushing us forward like cattle. Finally, we hit a sheer rock face and realized our mistake. Nowhere to go, no way to climb with Bobby hurt. We were cornered. That's when Ken made the call that probably saved our lives. He told us to spread out and get ready to fight. I carried my granddad's old 30-06, an old deer rifle that had dropped more bucks than I could count. Ken had his 308. Bobby carried a 12-gauge pump action loaded with slugs. Between the 3 of us, we had enough firepower to stop a grizzly. We just prayed it would be enough for whatever was hunting us. The first creature stepped out of the brush about 40 yards away. In the fading light, I finally saw it clear. Its face was almost human, but off somehow. The jaw too heavy, the brow too thick, eyes set too deep and too small. Its arms hung longer than any man's, ending in massive hands tipped with dark, thick fingers that looked strong enough to snap bones like twigs. Ken fired first. The shot slammed into its chest. The thing staggered back but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound I'll never forget. A roar and a scream rolled into one, pure rage and pain. 2 more stepped out, flanking the first, and suddenly all 3 came at us. Bobby's shotgun thundered twice, and I saw one of the creatures spin and crash to the ground, black blood spraying across the leaves. I squeezed the trigger on my rifle, the recoil slamming my shoulder as the round struck the biggest one. It dropped to a knee but kept coming, dragging itself forward on its knuckles like some wounded gorilla. That's when it all went to hell. The one Ken had hit first reached us before we could fire again. It swung one enormous arm, clamped onto Ken's waist, and lifted him clean off the ground like he was nothing. Ken screamed and fought to wrench his rifle free, but the thing was too strong. I heard his ribs crack under the pressure, sharp and sickening, like dry wood snapping in a fire. I was trying to line up a clean shot when the second one blindsided me. It was like getting hit by a refrigerator at full speed. I went down hard, my rifle skittering into the brush. The creature pinned me to the ground with one massive arm and clamped the other around my throat. Its breath hit me like a furnace full of rotting meat and wet fur. Up close, its eyes were bottomless black pits, no whites, no mercy. I thrashed, but it was too damn heavy, and its grip was tightening around my neck. Black spots crowded my vision when Bobby's shotgun exploded right above me. The blast caught the thing in the side of the skull. It reeled off me, howling like a dying horse, thrashing in the dirt. I scrambled to my knees, searching for my rifle, and caught sight of Ken. He was 6 yards away, limp in the monster's arms, his body flopping like a rag doll as it shook him. He wasn't moving. My stomach dropped. Bobby was backing toward the cliff face, shotgun trembling in his hands. His face was the color of chalk. From the tree line, 2 more of them emerged, moving cautiously now, wary of the firepower. One dragged its left leg, black blood matting its thigh. One of my bullets had found its mark, but it hadn't been enough. Another, the one I'd wounded earlier, was still crawling toward us, dragging itself forward with its uninjured arm. Bobby put a slug through its head, finally dropping it for good. But that still left 3, and Bobby's shells were running out. I spotted my rifle, dove for it, and slammed another round into the chamber. One of them was circling wide, trying to flank us. I tracked it the way I'd line up a deer in motion and squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore into its shoulder, spinning it, but not stopping it. These things were built to withstand punishment. The beast that had killed Ken dropped his body like trash and turned on us. Even from 30 yards out, I could see Ken's blood smeared across its chest and dripping from its massive hands. It opened its jaws and let out a roar so deep it vibrated the ground beneath my boots. Then it charged. Bobby fired his last slug at 15 yards, the blast punching into its chest and knocking it back, but it didn't stop. It thundered forward anyway. I lined up and let my final shot fly. The bullet slammed into its skull just as it reached us, snapping its head back and finally dropping the giant in a heap. For 2 heartbeats we thought maybe, just maybe, we'd survived. Then the howls came. Not 1, not 2, but a chorus, echoing through the valley from every direction. Dozens of them. We'd killed 3, but there were more out there, closing in. Bobby grabbed Ken's rifle and whatever rounds he could find. I shoved a handful of loose cartridges into my pockets. We didn't even talk about trying to bring Ken's body. We both knew the truth: if we made it out alive, that would already be a miracle. Leaving him there was the hardest thing I've ever done. But we had no choice. We started climbing the cliff face, desperate to put rock between us and them. The stone was loose and crumbling, tearing our hands open as we clawed our way up. The weight of the packs nearly dragged us back down, but the sounds behind us, branches snapping, brush crashing, those guttural calls kept us moving. Halfway up, Bobby's pack snagged on an outcrop and split wide open. Half his gear, food, spare clothes, his sleeping bag tumbled down the rock to smash on the boulders below. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We just climbed, bleeding and gasping. Near the top, I spotted a narrow ledge snaking around the face of the cliff. It looked like it might lead to a crevice or cave on the far side. It was only wide enough for 1 person at a time, and a good 100 feet of air yawned below it, but it was our only shot. Bobby went first, pressed flat against the wall, inching sideways along the slick, gravel-covered stone. I followed, refusing to look down. Halfway across, a howl erupted beneath us. I glanced down and nearly lost my grip. 2 of them were at the base of the cliff, staring up. One began to climb. It scaled the rock like a spider, finding holds on sheer stone where I saw nothing but smooth face. It moved fast, too fast. In minutes, it covered what had taken us an hour. Its eyes caught the faint glint of twilight, locked on us, unblinking. We reached the crevice just as the thing hauled itself over the rim behind us. Bobby squeezed through first, then me, shoving my pack through the narrow opening. As I scrambled in, I felt thick fingers graze my boot. I kicked back with everything I had, my heel smashing into something solid. The creature bellowed in pain and let go. We tumbled into the dark on the other side of the ridge. Another valley spread out before us, steeper, wilder, littered with deadfall and jagged rocks. It wasn't safer, but it wasn't the same valley we'd just fled. We could still hear them on the far side, their howls bouncing off the mountains, signaling, searching. We pushed on through the afternoon, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Bobby's ankle was shot, every step was a limp, his face twisted with pain, but he never complained. We both knew slowing down meant death. As the sun began to sink, it hit us. We were completely lost. Nothing looked familiar. The valley stretched endlessly in both directions. Without Ken, our guide, we were just guessing. We had maybe 2 hours of light left, and the calls from behind were still coming closer each time. Just as the darkness closed in, we stumbled across a shallow cave cut into the hillside. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. And that night, with the howls circling in the trees, It was the only thing standing between us and whatever was out there. It wasn't much, just a shallow rock cavity, maybe 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it gave us shelter for the night. We crawled inside, dragged a pile of dry branches across the entrance, and tried to rest. Sleep never came. All night long we heard them moving outside, heavy footsteps circling our hideout, pausing just beyond the barrier we'd thrown together. Once, something shoved against the branches, testing us. We sat there in the dark, rifles clutched tight, braced for them to break through, but they never did. When the first light of dawn filtered into the cave, the sounds finally stopped. We waited another full hour before pulling the branches aside and peering out. The soft dirt around the entrance was stamped with tracks, the same massive 5-toed prints we'd seen the day before. We knew we had to get out of that valley. Bobby's ankle was swollen twice its normal size, and all we had left was a couple of energy bars and half a bottle of water. Worse, we were still hopelessly lost. Every ridge looked the same. Every valley seemed to pull us deeper into the wilderness. Our only plan was to follow the valley downstream, hoping it would lead us to a bigger creek or river, something we could trace back toward civilization. Bobby hobbled along slowly, but we kept moving. For the first few hours, the forest was eerily calm. No howls, no knocks, no sign we were still being hunted. Then, around midday, Bobby spotted movement on the ridge above us. At first, it looked like a black bear walking the skyline, but when it stopped and turned our way, we saw it was upright, on 2 legs. It stood there watching us for several minutes before melting back into the trees. 10 minutes later, another one appeared on the opposite ridge. Then a third behind us, right on the trail we just walked. They were shadowing us like a pack of wolves, keeping to the high ground, tracking every move we made, always out of reach of the rifles. The harassment began early in the afternoon. Rocks started raining down from the ridges, not aimed to hit us directly, but close enough to make a point, to remind us they could. Some of those stones were the size of footballs, slamming into the earth hard enough to shatter. If one hit, it would kill. We pushed harder, moving as fast as Bobby's ankle would allow. But the monsters matched our pace. Soon they were in front of us, behind us, on both sides. Every time I glanced up, I caught sight of dark figures slipping through the trees. They were playing with us, bleeding us of hope the same way they'd done back at the cliff. By late afternoon, the valley narrowed. The creek ran between steep ridges that rose almost vertical on both sides. It felt like a canyon, only choked with brush and timber instead of bare rock. There was no way out except forward or back. Halfway through, Bobby froze and grabbed my arm. 100 yards ahead, something was standing in the stream. It was the biggest one we'd seen yet, at least 9 feet tall, built like a linebacker, blocking the path completely. It didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. We spun around, but another one had slipped in behind us. This one carried something in its hand, a club, a heavy branch broken off at one end. We were trapped. Sheer ridges on either side, no way to climb out. One blocking the exit, one closing in from behind. Ken would have known what to do, but Ken was dead. Now it was just me, Bobby, and maybe 8 rounds of ammunition between us, staring down creatures that had already proven they could take bullet after bullet and keep coming. The one with the club started forward. The one in the stream didn't budge, still sealing off the only way out. And in that moment, we knew we weren't getting out without a fight. It wasn't much, a shallow rock cavity, maybe 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it bought us a night. We crawled inside, shoved a pile of dead branches across the mouth, and tried to rest. Sleep didn't come. All night long we heard them moving outside, heavy footfalls circling our hiding place, stopping now and then right at the brush we'd piled up. Once something shoved the branches as if testing the barricade. We sat in the dark with rifles ready, waiting for them to break through. They never did. When the first gray light seeped into the hollow, the noises finally stopped. We waited an hour more before pushing the branches aside. The soft ground around the entrance was stamped with prints, the same massive 5-toed soles we'd seen before. We had to get out of that valley. Bobby's ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. We had maybe a couple of energy bars and half a bottle of water left, and we were turned completely around. Every ridge looked the same, every draw seemed to lead deeper into the woods. We decided to follow the valley downstream, hoping it would meet a larger creek or river we could follow back toward civilization. Bobby hobbled along, slow but steady. For a few hours the forest was oddly quiet, no howls, no knocks, nothing. Then at midday Bobby spotted movement on the ridge above. At first it looked like a black bear walking the skyline, But when it paused and turned our way, we saw it was upright on two legs. It watched us for a few minutes and then melted back into the trees. 10 minutes later, another appeared on the opposite slope, then another behind us on the trail we'd just come down. They were shadowing us like a pack of wolves, staying high to observe while keeping out of rifle range. The harassment began early in the afternoon. Rocks started raining down from the ridges, not aimed directly to hit us, but close enough to show they could. Stones the size of footballs slammed into the earth, shattering on impact. If one of those had hit a man, it would have killed him. We pushed harder, but the things matched our pace. Soon they were above us, below us, on both sides. Every time I glanced up, I'd catch a dark shape slipping through the trees. By late afternoon, the valley narrowed into something like a canyon, the creek running between near vertical walls on both sides, trees and scrub clinging to the slopes. There was only one way forward and one way back. Halfway through, Bobby stopped and grabbed my arm. 100 yards ahead, something stood in the stream. It was the biggest one, yet at least 9 feet tall, built like a linebacker standing dead center in our path. It didn't move, it just blocked the way. We spun around and another had slipped in behind us. That one carried a club, a thick branch broken off at one end. We were trapped, sheer slopes on either side with no way up or down. Ken would have known how to get us out. Ken was gone. It was just me and Bobby now, maybe 8 rounds between us, facing creatures that had already shown they could take rifle fire and keep coming. The one with the club started toward us. The one in the stream stayed put, sealing that exit. What happened next moved faster than anything an animal ought to manage, an orchestrated, clever motion that felt more human than wild. Bobby raised his rifle and aimed at the closer target. At 30 yards, even with his hands shaking, it should have been a simple shot. But when he squeezed the trigger, there was only an empty click. His chamber was dry. In the panic, after the cliff fight, he'd forgotten to reload. I had 3 rounds left. I fired the first into the monster's chest. It staggered but kept coming. My second round hit its shoulder and spun it around. The third, my last, struck its head and it finally went down. But the other one was already moving, racing up the stream toward us, water spraying at its legs, its club lifted high over its head. Bobby fumbled to reload, but his hands shook so badly he kept dropping shells. When it swung the club, it hit Bobby like a piece of wrecking yard iron. The sound was a dull, sick thud like a watermelon dropped on concrete. He went down instantly and didn't get up. I don't remember grabbing Bobby's rifle or the moment I ran. All I know is I slammed into the brush on the hillside, branches shredding my clothes, my pack long abandoned. Behind me, a beast screamed a sound. I couldn't tell if it was triumph or fury. I ran until my lungs burned, then ran some more. The slope was steep, loose rock, skidding underfoot. I fell twice, cut and bruised, but kept going. As night fell, I found myself on a ridge, riddled with small caves and hollows. Most were too shallow to help. But near the top, I found a narrow opening that led back into the rock, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through and narrow enough that nothing that size could follow. I crawled in, deeper and deeper, maybe 15 feet, until the passage tightened and I couldn't go any further. I sat in complete dark and listened to my breathing and my heart pounding. I don't know how long I waited before I heard heavy footsteps outside. They padded around the rock, stopping at several entrances, testing. Once a shadow blocked the faint moonlight at the mouth of the cave. Then I heard a scratching, like something dragging a heavy weight across stone. The sound grew closer. Horror dawned on me. They weren't trying to reach me. They were sealing me in. The dragging went on for hours, effort, noises, groans of exertion like a man straining under a burden. Slowly, the pale light at the cave mouth dimmed. They were stacking rocks, building a wall to lock me inside. I crawled as far back as I could in the dark and felt for a way out. Where the entrance had been, my hands only touched packed stones, an unbroken stone wall that let no light through. I was entombed by my own choices. Panic hit me like a blow. I clawed at the rocks until my nails broke and my hands bled, but the stones were too heavy, too tightly packed to move. My breath came ragged and shallow as the cold truth settled in. I might die down here and no one would find me. I forced myself to calm down and think. The tunnel ran maybe 15 feet before it pinched closed. The air felt thin but not foul. There had to be some ventilation, tiny cracks or seams in the rock I couldn't see. Maybe an hour, maybe a day, maybe 2 before oxygen ran low. My water bottle was back in my pack, lost in the scramble up the cliff. All I had to eat was half a pack of beef jerky tucked into my jacket pocket. I had no flashlight, no matches, no way to signal for help, just me in the dark with a growing certainty that I was going to die alone in that hole. I spent the first day clawing at every inch of stone I could reach, searching for loose rocks or cracks I could widen. I even tried digging at the dirt floor with my bare hands, hoping maybe I could tunnel beneath the wall. Nothing worked. The cave walls were solid granite, and the barricades sealing me in had been stacked with purpose built to withstand time and weather. Hunger wasn't the worst part, not yet. It was thirst. My mouth was so dry it felt stuffed with cotton, my lips cracked, and every attempt to swallow felt like sandpaper. I tried to conserve saliva, but it was hopeless. Every few hours I'd suck on the last shred of jerky I had, hoping for moisture, but it only made me thirstier. What broke me most was the silence. In the absolute darkness of that cave, my other senses sharpened until I could hear things no one should ever hear from their own body. The thump of my heartbeat, the rasp of air moving in and out of my lungs, the hollow churn of an empty stomach. From outside, nothing. No wind, no birdsong, no hint that the world beyond the stone still existed. I forced myself to think of my wife, my kids, the things I'd do when I got out. But as the hours dragged on, those thoughts slipped away like smoke. My mind drifted back to Ken and Bobby. Were their bodies still lying where they fell, or had those things dragged them off into the forest? By the second day, I was weakening fast. The jerky was gone. My throat burned like fire. I stopped trying to move rocks altogether. I didn't have the strength. At some point, I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of scraping outside the cave. For a moment, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it again. Stone grinding against stone. Something or someone was moving the barrier. Hope hit me like lightning. A search team, maybe. Somebody had found our abandoned camp and tracked us here. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. The scraping went on a few minutes, then stopped. No voices, only silence. Then, faint but real, slivers of light began to seep through cracks in the rocks. Not much, just threads of pale light, like moonlight through blinds. But after more than a day buried in blackness, it was blinding. One last scrape, louder than the rest, then heavy footsteps fading away. I waited an hour, maybe 3, I couldn't tell. Too afraid to move, too certain that whatever had opened the way was waiting just beyond. But thirst finally overpowered fear. I crawled forward, tugging stones aside until I found a gap just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I spilled out into the night. The forest was empty. No search party, no creatures, just moonlight streaming through the trees and wind whispering in the branches. I sat on the rocks outside, shaking, trying to make sense of it. Why would the very things that killed my friends and sealed me inside come back and set me free? It made no sense. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe a bear knocked the stones loose. Maybe the wall shifted on its own. But the rocks I found scattered around the entrance were too big, too deliberate. Somebody or something had meant for me to walk free. I was free, but lost. No food, no water, no clear path back to civilization. My rifle was still inside the cave, but I was too weak to crawl back in. Even if I had, there were only 2 rounds left, hardly enough against whatever was out there. So I picked a direction that sloped downhill and started walking. My ankle throbbed with every step, a souvenir from scrambling up that cliff, but standing still wasn't an option. For 2 days I stumbled through the wilderness, following game trails and creek beds, eating whatever berries I could find, drinking from rain puddles. I must have dropped 15 pounds in those 48 hours. When I finally staggered onto a ranger road, I could barely put one foot in front of the other. And the strangest part? I never saw or heard them again. No howls, no wood knocks, no giant footprints stamped in the mud, just silence. Like they'd vanished from the earth the moment they let me go. It was as if they had simply vanished. Or maybe they had decided I wasn't worth chasing anymore. Maybe killing Ken and Bobby was enough. Maybe that had been their goal all along. A ranger found me collapsed on the side of a service road the following Wednesday morning. I was delirious from dehydration and exposure, muttering about monsters, caves, and dead friends. They rushed me to a hospital, hooked me up to IVs, and called my wife. By the time I was lucid enough to explain what had happened, no one believed me. The sheriff listened politely, jotting notes in his pad, but I could see it in his eyes he thought I'd cracked from trauma, that I was hallucinating from hypothermia. The Park Service launched another search for Ken and Bobby, but their bodies were never recovered. A week later, the official report listed their deaths as the result of a bear attack. I tried to tell anyone who would listen what really happened. I showed them the photos Bobby had taken of those first footprints, but digital images can be dismissed as fake. I described the creatures in detail, their size, their intelligence, the way they hunted us like prey. Most folks gave me the kind of sympathetic nods you give someone who's clearly been through hell, but whose story you can't take at face value. My wife said she believed me, or at least she told me she did. The kids were too young to understand. Friends and neighbors treated me like I'd had some sort of breakdown, like I needed handling with kid gloves. The worst part was attending Ken and Bobby's funerals and listening to everyone whisper about the bear attack that took their lives. Their families deserved the truth. But what could I say? That their husbands and fathers were slaughtered by creatures no one believes exist? That the Park Service and Sheriff's Department were either covering it up or too blind to recognize what really happened? So I stayed quiet and let people believe what they wanted. It's been 3 years since that hunting trip. Plenty of time to replay every moment, to wonder what we stumbled into that weekend. Here is the horror story about Bigfoot killing the herd of livestock. Something started killing my livestock. What I'm about to share happened on my farm in northern Michigan, where I've raised cattle and chickens for 15 years. The attacks began 3 years ago, and what I've caught on trail cameras still haunts me in my sleep. This is my story, and the evidence is real. It was a bitter February morning when I found the first victims. Snow crunched under my boots as I made the rounds. Everything looked fine until I reached the chicken coop. The door was hanging wide open, banging in the winter wind. Inside, feathers blanketed the floor like a gruesome snowfall, and 3 of my best-laying hens were gone. At first, I blamed foxes or maybe coyotes. We've got plenty of those around, especially when food runs scarce in winter. But something didn't add up. The wire mesh had been ripped apart with incredible force, the metal twisted and curled outward like broken bones. No fox could do that. Even a coyote would have struggled to bend steel that thick. I spent the rest of the morning patching the coop, reinforcing the wire. Losing a few hens hurt, but it was manageable. Still, I couldn't afford to let it happen again. Those birds were my livelihood. Each loss hit the bank account harder than I could take. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time I lost 5 hens, and the damage was worse. The wooden frame of the coop was gouged with deep slashes. The marks looked like claw rakes, but far too big for any predator native to Michigan. Some were carved an inch deep into solid wood. Running my fingers along the grooves, I could feel the sharp edges. Whatever had done it, it was powerful, unnaturally powerful. I called the local game warden, hoping he could make sense of it. The next day he showed up, a man in his 50s who'd seen just about every kind of predator damage you can imagine. He walked the coop, studied the wire, ran his hand over the claw marks. Then he shook his head. He admitted he'd never seen anything quite like it. Maybe a bear, he said, but they should have been deep in hibernation. Maybe a big, mean coyote, or a neighbor's dog gone wild. I nodded, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't a dog. Dogs kill sloppy. They don't rip through fencing with surgical precision. This felt deliberate, calculated, different. For the next 6 months, the attacks continued, always at night, always during storms or under cover of heavy cloud. It was like the thing waited for low visibility, for the wind and rain to mask its presence. Each morning I'd wake to find damage, busted fences, shredded wire, broken boards, and always a few missing animals, never a massacre, just 1 or 2, maybe 3. Sometimes I'd find bones scattered across the property, but never enough to say for sure what predator had done it. Then, in April, the thing went after my cattle for the first time. I found a young bull out in the pasture, maybe a quarter mile from the barn. The sight of it turned my stomach. Its throat had been torn wide open, the back haunch ripped away like something had carved it out clean. But what rattled me most wasn't the gore, it was the absence of a fight. No broken fence posts, no trampled grass, not even a patch of mud torn up. Whatever had done this had taken down a 1,000-pound bull like it was nothing. No struggle, no noise, just a kill. That animal was worth $3,000, money I couldn't afford to lose. But worse than the dollars was the gut punch of watching something I'd raised from a calf. Watched, grow strong and healthy, get butchered like that. I spent the rest of the day pacing the land, looking for sign. The ground was soft from a recent rain, perfect for tracks. I found plenty of deer prints, plenty of cow tracks, even some of my own boot marks from earlier rounds. But near the bull's carcass, sunk deep in the mud, I found something else. One single print unlike anything I'd ever seen. At first glance, it looked a little like a big dog's paw, but the proportions were all wrong. The track was longer and narrower, the claw marks stretching way out past where the pad should have been. And the depth, that was the part that made me swallow hard. Whatever left it was heavy, far heavier than any dog or coyote. I laid my boot down beside it. My phone camera caught the comparison plain as day. The print was close to 8 inches long, 6 wide, with claw marks that gleamed under the mud. I've been around animals my whole life. I grew up tracking deer, hunting predators, reading the woods like a second language, but I'd never laid eyes on anything like that track. And after losing that bull, I knew I had to do something. Couldn't afford another loss, couldn't keep pretending I didn't know something was out there. That Saturday, I drove into town and bought 4 trail cams. The good kind, motion-activated infrared night vision. They weren't cheap, but they were my best shot at figuring out what I was up against. I spent the whole weekend setting them up, 2 by the chicken coop, 1 covering each approach, a 3rd out near the cattle pasture, right where I'd found the bull. The 4th I strapped to a tree along the deer trail that cut through the woods behind the property. My thinking was simple. Whatever was killing my stock had to be moving through there, maybe more than once. Those cameras were sensitive enough to pick up a squirrel. They'd trigger at the slightest movement, date and time stamped. I started checking the SD cards every few days, half eager, half sick with dread about what I might find. For almost 2 months, nothing. Just deer wandering by, the occasional raccoon, even a barn cat sneaking across the coop. I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves were scaring it off. Some animals can pick up infrared. Maybe it knew, maybe it had moved on. Then, end of June, the attacks started again. 3 more hens gone, and this time the coop looked like a tornado had hit it. Boards ripped straight out, metal hinges bent like tin foil. It looked like something had grabbed the whole damn structure and twisted until it gave. No fox, no coyote, not even a bear could do that. Not barehanded. But this time I had a sliver of hope. One of the cameras had been aimed dead at the coop. I remember my hands shaking as I pulled that card, slid it into my laptop. Dozens of harmless pictures: raccoon sniffing around at 2:47 a.m., neighbor's cat at 4:13. And then, right in the middle of it all, 3:22 a.m., a frame that changed everything. There it was, standing just yards from the coop. At first glance, you'd swear it was a man. Upright, 2 legs, arms hanging at its sides. But then you look closer, and the proportions don't match. Too tall, 7 feet, maybe 7 to 2. Broad as a barn door. Limbs too long, too thick. The whole body covered in dark hair or fur. The head elongated, shaped like a dog's. Eyes glowing like burning coals in the camera's flash. And those hands, that's what froze me cold. Not paws, hands. 5 long fingers with an opposing thumb. Human-like, except for the claws curved, gleaming talons that caught the infrared flash like polished steel. The same claws that had shredded my boards, ripped open my coop, left scars in the wood deeper than any hatchet. I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a costume, a glitch. But I knew better. That thing wasn't a bear, and it damn sure wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything in the Michigan Wildlife Guide. It was something else. And then all the stories I'd heard as a kid came rushing back, the whispers about the Michigan dogman, the half-man, half-wolf thing said to prowl the woods around the Great Lakes. Tales I'd laughed off as backwoods folklore. But there it was, staring back at me through the glow of a trail cam, standing in my yard, at my coop, on my land. I'd always figured those old stories were just campfire tales, folklore, spun to scare kids and pass the time on long nights. But now I had photographic proof that something matching those descriptions was real. And it had haunted my farm for months. The next morning, I called the game warden again. This time, I wasn't just a nervous farmer with a bad story. I had evidence. Real, hard proof on film of what was tearing through my livestock. I was anxious, almost relieved, convinced that at last someone in authority would take me seriously. That afternoon, the warden rolled in, this time with a colleague from the Department of Natural Resources. I walked them through the damage, the shredded coop, the claw marks gouged into wood deep enough to catch your fingertip. Then I fired up my laptop, pulled up the trail cam image, and sat back expecting the shock to hit them like it had hit me. But the look on their faces wasn't awe, it was irritation. They glanced at the screen, then at each other, and back at me with tight, skeptical smirks. The warden shook his head and slammed my laptop shut harder than he needed to. "You really think we're going to fall for this?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is fake as hell. Photoshop can make anything look real these days." I tried to protest, tried to explain I didn't even know how to fake a picture like that if I wanted to, but they weren't listening. Their minds had been made up the moment they pulled in the driveway. To them, I wasn't a man begging for help. I was a crank wasting their time. The DNR officer chimed in. "Look, we get it. You've had some predator trouble, and we're sympathetic. But filing false reports and creating phony evidence, that's a serious offense. You could be charged for interfering with a wildlife investigation." The warden nodded along. "We'll let this one slide with just a warning and a fine. But if you bother us with more of these tall tales, we'll take action." They wrote me a citation, $300 for filing a false report, a slap in the face. Then they got in their truck and drove away, leaving me standing there in the dust, feeling more alone and powerless than I'd ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to protect me had not only ignored the danger, they'd punished me for daring to bring it up. That night, as I sat awake listening to the distant cries of my animals, it sank in. I was on my own. If the authorities wouldn't help, I'd have to defend my farm myself. Over the next several weeks, I poured every ounce of energy into fortifying the place. Obsession doesn't even begin to cover it. I rebuilt the chicken coop from scratch, this time with pressure-treated lumber reinforced with steel brackets at every joint. I replaced the old wire with heavy welded mesh, the kind you'd need bolt cutters to get through. The door had 3 locks, the frame was solid metal, and the whole thing looked more like a jail cell than a chicken coop. Around it, I put up a secondary fence, 8-foot posts with barbed wire strung across the top. To anyone driving by, it must have looked like I was running a prison camp. I didn't care. I wasn't building it to impress the neighbors, I was building it to keep my animals alive. The cattle were tougher. I couldn't fortress the whole pasture, but I could at least make it harder for anything to sneak close. I cleared 40-50 yards of brush around the fencing, stripped away every sapling and hiding spot. Then I set up motion sensor floodlights every 100 feet, so that any big movement out there would light the night up like a football stadium. Finally, I invested in an electric fence system hot wire running both along the top and the bottom of the posts. High voltage, high enough to keep out anything that tried to climb or dig its way under. For a while, it seemed to work. The attacks stopped. The nights stayed quiet. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd beaten it. Maybe this thing had figured out my farm was too much trouble and moved on to easier pickings. I should have known better. One muggy August night, I was jolted awake by a chorus of panic. Chickens screaming, cattle bellowing in agony from the far pasture. My heart hammered as I grabbed my rifle from the bedroom closet and charged outside, adrenaline and dread surging together. What I saw stopped me cold. Despite every barricade, every layer of defense, it had gotten through. The welded wire mesh was shredded apart like tissue paper. The steel doorframe was twisted into a grotesque shape like a pretzel. 3 hens were gone. The survivors huddled in the far corner, silent, trembling, too terrified even to cluck. Then I turned toward the pasture and felt my stomach sink. One of my cows lay sprawled in the dirt near the fence, its throat ripped open just like the young bull months earlier. The electric fence had been torn down. The hot wire lay on the ground in coils, still sparking faintly like dead snakes. And standing there in the half-dark, I realized the worst part wasn't the loss of another animal. It wasn't the money, though that stung too. No, the real blow was what this thing had just proven. It had adapted. It had studied every wall I'd built, every trap I'd laid, and then it tore through them with ease. All my work, all my money, all my late nights building a fortress obliterated in one attack. This wasn't just predation anymore. It was domination. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just feeding off my farm. It was toying with me, terrorizing me, showing me that no matter what I did, it was stronger. And standing there in the wreckage before dawn, surrounded by the smell of blood and twisted metal, I felt something heavier than fear settle over me defeat. That creature had adapted, learned my defenses, figured out my fences, and blown through every obstacle I'd built. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of months of hard work, I felt a crushing wave of defeat. This wasn't just about livestock anymore. This was a campaign of terror, systematic and deliberate, as if the thing enjoyed proving its dominance over me. I sat on the porch the rest of that night, rifle laid across my lap, eyes locked on the tree line. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I was bone-tired, worn down to the marrow, but I couldn't bring myself to leave my animals unguarded. 3 nights later, the sounds came again, panic from the pasture, frantic bawling from the herd. This time, I was ready. Still in my sleep clothes, I snatched up the rifle from beside my bed and was outside within seconds of the first terrified bellow. The moon hung nearly full, bright enough to lay silver across the pasture and woods. I moved along the fence line, slow, careful, scanning for the cause of the chaos. The cattle had bunched together near the barn, every single head turned toward the far end of the field where the trees pressed up against the open ground, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the timber, half hidden by a thicket, stood a dark figure. Even at that distance, I could tell it was tall, upright, moving with a fluidity that was half human, half beast. The same silhouette caught by my trail cam months earlier. The source of months of hell. My hands shook as I raised the rifle and settled behind the scope. The figure was swallowed mostly by shadow, but enough of it showed for me to know exactly what I was looking at. That long head, that heavy build. The way it hunched low like a predator ready to spring. Not a bear, not a wolf, not anything in the normal order of things. I drew a breath, steadied, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, echoing across the field. Through the glass, I saw the figure jolt, stumble back, then fade into the tree line. A sound followed something I will never forget. A howl that shook the night, half wolf, half man, but threaded with rage and pain so raw it froze my blood. For the first time in months, I'd struck back. For the first time, I'd made it bleed. But the rush of victory evaporated almost instantly. I knew what I'd just done. If this thing ran in packs, if there were more like it in the woods, then I hadn't won a battle, I'd declared war. I stayed outside until dawn, rifle clutched tight, bracing for retaliation that never came. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the branches made me spin toward the sound, finger tight on the trigger. I expected glowing eyes in the dark. I expected the thud of heavy bodies circling, but the forest held its silence. When morning broke, I went to the spot where I'd seen it. The brush was thick with raspberry thorns and fallen timber, hard to navigate, but I pushed through. Near a massive oak, maybe 20 yards from where I'd taken the shot, I found it dark stains smeared on bark, droplets scattered in the leaf litter below, blood, plenty of it. I followed the trail, tying strips of orange tape along the way so I wouldn't lose myself. At first, it was easy, steady drops and smears on branches as the creature pushed through. Whatever I'd hit was bleeding heavy and moving hard. The path angled northeast toward the national forest bordering my land. I knew those woods well enough. I'd hunted their edges plenty, but I'd never gone deep. Too rough. Steep ravines, cedar thickets, so dense they could swallow a man whole. Half a mile in, the trail just stopped. The blood vanished. No more drops. No more broken brush. Like the thing had simply vanished into thin air. That's when I saw the tree. On the trunk of a huge maple, fresh gouges clawed deep into the bark. Not the old scars of a bear marking territory. These were raw, ragged, desperate, wild in a way that felt more emotional than animal. Around the base of the brush, I found coarse, dark hair snagged in the lower branches. Not deer hair, not cow, not like anything I'd ever seen. Thick, wiry, almost oily to the touch. It was the same kind of sign I'd found months ago around my chicken coop, but this was different. Frenzied, agitated. Proof that whatever I'd shot hadn't just bled, it had gone berserk. I gathered up what evidence I could, blood-soaked leaves, tufts of coarse dark hair, sealing it all carefully into plastic bags, hoping one day it might be tested. But despite the samples, the gouges in the bark, the trail of blood, I followed deep into the woods. I never found a body. Whatever I hit that night, I'd hurt it badly, maybe mortally, but it hadn't died there. It had vanished into the wilderness, leaving only questions in its wake. From that night forward, the attacks stopped. Days stretched into weeks, and then into months, without a single sign of the creature. My remaining livestock settled back into their routines, grazing and feeding without the constant panic that had haunted them for so long. For the first time in nearly a year, I started sleeping through the night, no longer jolted awake by terrified bawls from the pasture or the thunder of hooves in the dark. The trail cameras I'd mounted all around my property kept rolling, but they showed only the ordinary wildlife I'd grown used to. Deer slipping through the brush, raccoons nosing around the barn, the occasional fox slinking under the fence. No hulking silhouettes, no eerie eye shine glaring back at the infrared flash. It was as if the thing had never existed at all. I should have felt relieved, and part of me did. The financial bleeding had stopped. The constant dread that every morning I'd step out to another slaughter was gone, but the abruptness of it all gnawed at me. Had I killed it that night? The amount of blood I'd found suggested a serious, maybe even fatal wound. If so, where was the body? I'd combed the woods and found nothing. Or maybe it hadn't been alone. Maybe the creature was part of a larger pack, and when it went down, the others had carried it off. That would explain the sudden disappearance of tracks, and it raised the most unsettling possibility of all, that there were more of them, watching from the tree line. Another thought haunted me. Maybe it had been smart enough to simply move on. Wounded and wary, it could have left the area for good, seeking easier hunting grounds where it wouldn't face a man with a rifle. That explanation made the most sense, but it also meant I wasn't just up against an animal. I'd been in a battle of wits with something intelligent enough to know when it was beaten. Months passed, and still no answers. The samples I'd collected were examined by a friend of mine, a veterinarian, but he couldn't match the hair to any known species. Wildlife biologists' eyes showed the blood photos to dismiss them as deer or bear sign, nothing unusual. They waved off my insistence that the circumstances were different. So I carried on, keeping the defenses I'd built around my property intact. The motion-activated floodlights still washed the pasture in white every time a deer wandered too close. The reinforced fences still stood, wire-hot with current. I still slept with my rifle propped against the nightstand. The cameras kept filling up with images: deer, raccoons, foxes, the occasional black bear lumbering by, but never again the shadow that had terrorized my farm. And yet, on stormy nights, when the wind whipped through the trees and the rain pounded on the roof, I couldn't help but wonder. Was it still out there, somewhere in the dark timber, waiting for me to let my guard down? Or had it moved on to torment some other unlucky farmer? Maybe it had bled out beneath the pines, bones now scattered by scavengers. The truth is, I may never know what really happened that night, or what that thing truly was. The only undeniable evidence I still have is that grainy trail cam photo, the dark figure with the long head and glowing eyes that refuses to let me forget. No matter what label the experts or skeptics want to slap on it, the truth remains the same. I know what I saw. I know what hunted me, what tore through my farm, what left me staring down glowing eyes in the night. The Michigan Dogman, or whatever name you choose to give, it is real. My scarred fences, the ruined barns, and the drained savings account are proof enough for me. The attacks may have stopped, but the memories never fade. Every time I walk the fence line after dark, every time I hear a branch snap in the woods, I can feel its presence all over again. That photo from the trail camera is still burned into my mind. The long head, the too powerful frame, the predatory gleam in its eyes. It isn't just an image on a screen. It's a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. I've studied that picture 1,000 times, frame by frame, detail by detail, hoping to uncover some clue, anything that would explain what I encountered. But the more I look, the more certain I am of what it shows. Something that straddles the line between man and beast, not quite human, not quite animal. A predator designed by nature, or perhaps by something far stranger, to stalk and kill. Wildlife officials called it fake. Some laughed in my face. Others threatened me with fines and false report charges. But not one of them could explain how a farmer with no computer skills was supposed to fabricate an image so detailed, so consistent with the carnage left behind. I offered them the original SD card, begged them to have it analyzed forensically. No one ever took me up on it. It was easier to dismiss me as a crank than to confront the possibility that monsters still roam our woods. Over time, I found others, farmers, hunters, rural families scattered across Michigan and beyond who whispered their own stories. They spoke of towering, dog-headed figures glimpsed along lonely back roads, of livestock mutilated in patterns too clean to be the work of coyotes, of howls at night that froze the blood in their veins. Most never reported their encounters to officials. Why would they? The best-case scenario was ridicule. The worst was punishment. Instead, we built our own quiet network, swapping details and survival strategies in hushed tones. And as the stories piled up, a pattern began to emerge. These things weren't confined to my land, or even to my county. They'd been surfacing across the Great Lakes region for generations, always in isolated places, always where the wild still pressed up against civilization. From those accounts, a picture emerges. Solitary, territorial hunters. Opportunistic feeders that strike hardest at the easiest prey, chickens, calves, anything defenseless. They favor storms and dark nights, when human senses are dulled and chaos covers their movements. And worst of all, they learn. Every failed attempt to keep them out only teaches them how to get in the next time. I've spent endless hours poring over explanations, ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. Some researchers argue these creatures could be the last remnants of some prehistoric predator, a holdover that learned how to stay hidden in the remote wilderness. That theory at least explains their intelligence and uncanny ability to avoid detection. Others suggest mutations, wolves, or bears warped by genetics, disease, or environmental toxins. But that never accounted for the consistency of the sightings across decades. You can't explain away 100 years of reports with a single fluke of DNA. And then there are the theories you can't discuss in polite company. The ones that reach into folklore, into the supernatural. Native legends speak of spirits that walk between the worlds of man and beast. Campfire tales warn of shapeshifters and cursed bloodlines. Most people laugh those off. I used to too. But after what I lived through, I can't dismiss them so easily. Supernatural explanations run the gamut from shape changers to interdimensional visitors. None of those theories are testable by science, but they try to account for the parts of encounters like mine that seem impossible, the way something can appear and vanish without leaving a sensible trace. Personally, I lean toward the mundane and biological, a flesh and blood mammal, one that has evolved or adapted in ways that let it survive on the edges of human civilization. Its smarts and adaptability would be its survival tools, allowing it to exploit prey and habitat without ever confronting our numbers or our technology head-on. Those awful months changed me in ways that money can't fix. I used to think of myself as the owner of this little patch of land, confident I could protect my animals and keep my way of life going. Now I know I'm just another species sharing territory with things I don't fully understand. The financial wounds were bad enough, but the psychological ones cut deeper. I am permanently on guard, listening for the sound of something returning to terrorize my place. Even in broad daylight, when common sense tells me I'm safe, I still find myself scanning the tree line for the slightest movement. My relationship with local authorities is broken beyond repair. Their indifference to the evidence I showed them taught me a hard lesson. I can't count on help when it matters most. I learned to rely entirely on my own resources to protect this farm. That isolation has been the cruelest part of the whole ordeal. At the same time, it forced some unexpected growth. I learned more about the wildlife that lives around me. I developed a deeper respect for the wildness that borders my fields. And I found a loose network of other folks, farmers, hunters, rural residents who'd had similar experiences. There's consolation in knowing you're not the only one looking over your shoulder. 3 years have passed since the attacks began, and more than a year since they stopped. I still farm the same ground, raise the same animals, and keep the routines that have defined my life for decades. But everything is different now, tinted by the knowledge that there are things in this world that don't fold neatly into any textbook. The creature that terrorized my farm may be gone, but it left a permanent impression on how I view reality. I know now that somewhere out in the vast northern Michigan woods, there are predators that don't belong in any biology class I learned from. I know the line between civilized life and wilderness is far thinner than most people think, and I know that no amount of proof will make everyone believe. My trail cam photo will be dismissed as a hoax. My story will be filed alongside 1,000 other backwoods tall tales. That has been the most bitter part, living through something extraordinary and not being able to convince the world it was true. Still, for the handful of people who've walked the same dark path, who've heard those howls and seen the eyes in the flash, my story is both warning and comfort. These creatures are real. They can be dangerous, but they aren't invincible. Courage and stubbornness will make them think twice. The Michigan Dogman is out there. I have a picture to prove it, and the scars on my land to remind me. Will it come back? Will others like it keep moving through the Great Lakes woods? I don't know. All I know is I live with the fact that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most imagine. And sometimes, on a late night when the wind whistles through the branches and my motion lights cut through the dark, I remember those reflective eyes staring straight into my camera. I also know there are mysteries better left undisturbed. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and share to support me. It's no surprise the military attracts a wide mix of personalities, and among them you'll find plenty of rough, hardy men who'd rather spend a weekend in the woods than doing anything else. Part of the reason so many service members report strange encounters is simple. They get sent to places most civilians never go. Remote deployment zones abroad, sure, but even here at home, our backcountry is vast. The Appalachians, for example, are as isolated and unforgiving as any foreign range. I once saw a map overlay that stuck with me. One layer showed locations of people who'd gone missing across the United States. The layer beneath it mapped the nation's cave systems. The two datasets lined up too closely to be coincidence. It suggested that some missing people might be injured and unable to escape, or worse, that whatever is out there may be the cause of their disappearances. What follows are two true accounts from veterans. One is a Marine who served in Iraq, the other served in the 1,982nd, possibly in the Army, though the exact branch isn't specified. Both men grew up in the woods. Both are used to life under open sky, and both say that after their encounters they no longer feel the same way about the forest. These are real stories from two ex-service members who believe they were stalked, hunted, even by something enormous that can mimic the sounds of other animals. We'd been talking like any two old friends do in the woods, a little ragged, half joking, half on guard. "You go that way, I'll take the ridge." "You good, man?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Maybe it's 'cause we haven't been out here in a while." Little stuff like that. Then the talk trailed off and the woods went quiet the way they do right before something goes wrong. The first story comes from a US Marine who posted it online under the handle Brian, so that's what I'm calling him here. After his first deployment to Iraq, he came home and, like a lot of us, leaned on the land and the familiar rhythms of the woods to keep his head straight. He grew up on the high scrub where the desert runs into timber, lots of trees but not a lot of water. He knew those hills like the back of his hand. Hunting was part habit, part heritage, tracking the old trails, finding arrow, points the native folks had left behind, little things like that. One night, he and his best buddy, another Marine, he called Boot because the guy had just come out of boot camp, went out to run down a pack of coyotes that had been terrorizing local farms. Coyotes are night animals. They like the cover of dark and they howl a lot, so it made sense to hunt them after sundown. They were doing the usual, making distressed prey calls, playing the trick that predators use on predators, pretend to be a wounded pup or a rabbit and wait for something to come investigate. They got in position and started working their tactic, but something about it felt off. Maybe it's been a while since we've been out, Brian thought. Maybe they changed their tactics. They shrugged that off and kept moving tighter toward what they'd figured was the den. At about 25 yards from the entrance to the wolf den, both of them realized the sounds didn't belong to coyotes. It's hard to explain a feeling more than anything. They froze. They slid back out of the trees to a safer spot and shut up, waited, watched. Brian's memory of the next stretch is fuzzy, not quite an hour, he thinks, but the first sharp moment he does remember is Boot calling his name the way Marines do, clipped and urgent. A few minutes later, they saw movement. Something stepped out of the trees. At first, it looked like a man. Then it didn't. It was upright, but it was the height of the big pines, 7 to 10 feet high. Brian felt his gut flip. Whether it was adrenaline, PTSD, or plain terror, he raised his rifle and fired. The thing stumbled, took a couple of steps, and didn't go down. It kept going. Boot opened up and the same thing happened. They went instantly into fight mode and pumped rounds at it, expecting it to fold. They thought at first it was trying to lure them using their own predator tricks against them, but instead it stopped, pivoted away from their position like it suddenly decided it wasn't worth the fight, and walked off. Brian was shooting a 308, Boot had a 306. Whatever this was, it ought to have gone down after the first 5 rounds. By all the rules they knew, it didn't. They thought about chasing it, but in the end, they didn't. They had reason enough to stay put and get the hell out of there. We finally realized we didn't have what it took to kill it. Whatever it was, we didn't have the gear, the angle, or the luck. So we pulled back a tactical retreat about a quarter mile, and then we just put it behind us and went home. A week later, we found the real den, 10 miles the other side of town. Whatever had attacked us had obviously been trailing us for a long time, baiting us out that far, leading us the wrong way, laying plans. It even knew how to leave scat and urine that mimicked different members of a coyote pack. It was trying to make us believe we were chasing coyotes. My buddy and I still hunt now and then, but we never treated that one like a joke. Again, we would still say, half laughing, "Remember when we were being hunted?" Like it was something almost comic in the retelling, until you remember what it felt like out there. There's a local color to these places. "Hey kid, don't go down that road." "Yeah, ma'am, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trespass." "Young man, don't you ever walk that way." There's a reason they close tracks and fence off old roads. The old folks will tell you stories if you ask. Go on up on the porch and say a prayer. They'll tell you. I'll hand you some lemonade, son, but don't wander out there. Folks often portray the big two-legged ape things wandering North American woods as curious and mostly harmless. Brian's story blows that polite image apart. It shows a more predatory side. The next story takes place on Walden Ridge in Tennessee and gives us another perspective on the uncanny mimicry these creatures are capable of. This next account comes from an unnamed veteran who goes by Mark. He's written up his encounter under the name Jack Whistle, and he swears it's true. He says he's never told anyone the full story before, for reasons you'll understand once you hear it. The tale unfolds across different times in his life. Mark's 53 now. He grew up south of Walden Ridge in East Tennessee, a broad plateau that runs most of the way up the state on the east side of the Squatchy Valley. He was raised in a tiny mountain town, about 200 people, everyone knowing everyone else. The community is ringed by woods, right next to the Apprentice Cooper Wildlife Refuge. When he was a kid, he and his friends rode bikes across the old dirt tracks and trails. Hiking the mountain to hunt and explore was the pastime of choice. In 1976, when he was 12, he had an old mini bike that took him deeper into the woods than he'd been before. That's when he found an old dirt road, twin ruts, carved by long abandoned wheels, and that is where his story begins. That old dirt track, the one with twin ruts cut by some long dead wagon, runs deeper into the woods than most kids dared go. I followed it one afternoon, and when I came out the other end, heading back toward town, an old woman on her front porch called me over. I knew who she was by sight. She'd lived in that hollow her whole life, her family rooted there for generations. I won't use her real name here. She asked if I'd been all the way down that road. Yeah, ma'am, I said. She fixed me with a look and said, Boy, you never walk that road. There's a reason they blocked it off. I was curious. Why? I asked. Sit down, she said, and I'll tell you a story. She started slow, the way old-timers do, like she'd told it 100 times, though I never heard it before. Whether you believe it or not isn't my business, she said, but ask around and folks will tell you the same. That's how I first heard about the thing the locals call Jack Whistle. It sounds silly at first, I'll admit, like a name someone made up, but think about the names people give animals. Bobwhite for the quail that whistles, or sunfish for that golden-bellied perch. Names stick because of the sounds those critters make. The old woman had lived in that community forever. Her family had been there since not long after Boone and Crockett first pushed into Tennessee. Her story went way back to the early 1900s, before World War I, when people still rode horses and carried guns and the ridge was real wilderness. This all happened before TVA lines and lights came through the holler. For the sake of the tale, she named two families, we'll call them the Smiths and the Browns, who farmed opposite sides of the same little valley. On Saturdays, sometimes their boys would gather at one farm or the other to play cards, drink moonshine, and generally blow off steam. These weren't party animals by nature. They were early to bed, up at dawn mountain folks. But on that one Saturday night, the visit ran late. The card games lasted past midnight. Finally, around 1 in the morning, the boys mounted their horses and started home. Their trail to the bottom of the hollow crossed a shallow creek on a little sandbar beneath a big lookout rock. As they were crossing that night, something up on the rock started making a sound, a bird call, harmless enough on the face of it, but whatever it was spooked the horses. All but one bolted across the creek and up the trail in a panic. The youngest kid's mount reared and threw him. His lantern fell into the sand and somehow didn't break, and that might have saved his life. His brothers managed to get their horses under control and galloped back. When they reached the creek, they heard 6 quick shots from a .45. Riding closer, they found their kid on his knees by the lantern, fumbling to reload his pistol, shaking so hard he dropped rounds. A few feet away lay his horse, dead, blood running from a wound in its throat. I shot it, he kept saying. I shot it. I never miss. It took them a while to get the whole story out of him, but the youngest finally admitted that when his horse threw him, he'd looked up and seen 2 huge, glowing red eyes on top of the rock. The thing had whistled again as it leapt straight at his horse. Everything happened so fast he barely had time to empty his .45 before it was on top of the animal, dragging it down. He said it was massive, hunched but running on 2 legs, ragged and foul-smelling. His quick pistol shots weren't enough to save the horse, but he knew he'd hit it because it snarled, then tore off into the timber. That was all the brothers needed to hear. Terrified but determined, they hauled him up onto one of their mounts and rode home as fast as the animals could carry them. At first light, every one of the boys and their fathers saddled up with rifles and headed back to that creek crossing. They were seasoned hunters and trackers, but when they arrived, the horse was gone. So was the saddle, the rifle, scabbard, every bit of gear. The sand looked swept clean, as if somebody had dragged a pine bough across it. Even the blood was partly covered. No tracks, no trail. Nothing but faint traces of blood mixed into the sand. I'll never forget the way that old woman squeezed my arm when she told me this part. The look on her face made me believe every word. I told her right then I'd never go down that road again, and I meant it. For years, I'd take the long way around the highway just to avoid it. What I didn't know then was that the story wasn't over. 13 years later, I was 25. I'd served 4 years in the military, been through a short, failed marriage, and come back to the mountain trying to put myself back together. Early depression had me wandering the woods whenever I wasn't working. The forest gave me peace, and I had a favorite spot just below the summit, a stretch of sandstone bluffs on the mountain's west side, where an old-growth pine forest stood. If you've ever walked through an old pine stand, you know the feeling. Those towering trees cast such a heavy canopy that undergrowth barely exists. Instead of crunching on dry leaves, your boots fall silent on a carpet of shed pine needles. The air is hushed, cool, and strangely calm. Moss grows thick in the shaded spots, and everything feels older, quieter, like the woods themselves are holding their breath. That evening, I'd been wandering under those cliffs with a small pack, some food, a few drinks, and odds and ends. I stayed out longer than I should have, well into the night. Foolish, maybe, but I loved the solitude. That place was several miles from the hollow I'd heard the Jack Whistler story about, on the far side of the plateau. Still, it had the same feeling. Wild, ancient, and just a little uneasy if you lingered too long. I'd packed light that night, a little gear, a couple of flashlights in case I found a cave to peer into, and my old Winchester Model 97 12-gauge. That shotgun holds 5 in the tube and 1 in the chamber, and if you're stupid enough to be wandering the woods at night like I was, you ought to know better than I did. Lots of things lined up that brought me out there around midnight. I'd been sitting at a primo spot where you can see the valley lights a dozen miles off, sipping bourbon, letting the quiet do what it does. When I started packing up to head back, something called. It sounded like a bobwhite, a quail call out on the slope a few hundred yards away. For 2 or 3 seconds, everything was normal. Then I stopped. If that had been any normal nightbird, I wouldn't have flinched. But bobwhites aren't nightbirds. That should have been the end of it. Instead, I heard an answering call from higher up the slope, and then the first call back down below me. In 3 directions, the same call was echoing, and now I knew something was closing in. I shouldn't have been surprised. I'd been stupid about this place before. I jammed the last gear in my pack, hoisted it on, shouldered the Winchester, and started up the cliff. The moon was bright, so I didn't want to use a flashlight and give my position away, but as I slipped through the thicker patches of brush, I taped one of my flashlights to the tubular magazine under the barrel of my scattergun, a crude rig, but it gave me a forward light without having to hold the beam. Even so, those bobwhite calls kept answering one another, getting closer now, no matter how light-footed I got. Panic started to come in like a tide. I've walked these woods my whole life. I can read the animals. What was out there was moving in ways outside my experience. Their footsteps, if that's what they were, tried to match mine. Heavy, deliberate steps, then a pause, 1 or 2 thuds, then quiet. They weren't going to let me be easy prey. That's when the old story I'd heard years ago, the Jack Whistle tale the old woman told, came back to me. I began to suspect what might be following me. I could feel it, the tracking pressure, the awareness behind my neck. With that came a plan. I knew exactly where I was. I was above a stretch of cliff where the pines grew thick, about 500 feet above the rock face. At the base of that cliff, water and time had carved a deep, narrow cleft through the sandstone, a V-shaped slot maybe 4 feet wide at its throat, running 30 feet back along the left side undercut. Over generations, weather had peeled away layers of rock and created a shelf that led to an opening just big enough for a man of my size to squeeze through. Past that opening, you pull up onto a ledge 30 feet off the lower rock face. From there, a narrow belly crawl led 40 or 50 feet to a stone slide you could scramble up to the top. The whole bluff was 80 to 100 feet high. It wasn't quick, but it was concealed, the kind of place you use to put distance between you and something dumb enough to give chase. I moved fast and quiet. What should have been a minute or two felt like slow hours. I wormed into the cleft, hauled my pack and gun through the tight slot, then hauled myself up onto the ledge. No more whispering steps on the other side of the rock. Now I had to belly, crawl, and shoulder my way through before I could make the final push up the slick stone slide. When I topped out, I crawled into the pine grove and leaned my back against one of those ancient trunks, dropped my pack and set the shotgun across my knees. I fumbled out a bottle and took a swallow. My hands were shaking, the bourbon dripped when I put the bottle down. That's when the sound hit me again, footsteps and a bobwhite call. I still don't know how they got up that cliff so fast. The bluff runs half a mile to the south and almost a mile and a half to the north. The only easy route up is that narrow cleft. And yet they were on the rim, heavy boot steps, longer than a man's stride. They were approaching. I slammed the bottle down and grabbed the Winchester, thumbed the pump to cock it, pulled a shell from the pack and slid it into the tube so I'd have a full tube and another in the chamber. The steps stopped at the tree line, just deep enough in the brush to hide them from the flashlight's beam. The light quivered in my hands. Why hadn't they come up into the clearing? Why hadn't they exposed themselves? I aimed the light at the last place I'd heard the sound and held the beam steady. My heart was hammering. The bobwhite call came again right where I'd been standing moments before, and whatever was out there didn't answer like a bird. It answered like something mocking a bird, coming closer with a patience that was almost clinical. I felt the hair on my arms prick under the light. Adrenaline flooded me up into my jaw. I kept the barrel up and the lamp steady, and whatever was hiding in the pines stayed on the edge, just out of the cone of the beam. They had me watched, they had me figured out, and they had time. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears as they moved. I could make out long, heavy footsteps sweeping around me, each step angling a little different. They were circling, closing in. Panic hit me. I swung the shotgun back and forth, waiting for a target. They circled all the way to the far side of the grove, keeping away from the cliff, then came together again like they were trying to find a blind spot where they could hit me without being seen. I kept the barrel pointed at the patch of brush where I thought they were, and I'd had enough. I fired, pumped, and fired again. Then I heard a scream. God, I nearly peed myself. It wasn't a scream of pain so much as a furious, hideous roar. It sounded like a chimp scream on TV, except deeper and hoarser, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Right after that, they ran through the brush and away from me, splashing across the plateau and into the deeper woods. I don't know how long they were gone. It felt like an eternity, maybe just a little while. Eventually, I realized they'd vanished. I thought to check my watch, though I'd avoided it because looking down meant lowering the gun. Finally, I forced myself. It was 3:18 a.m., about 2.5 hours before dawn. I waited until I could see well enough to move without getting ambushed, then ran straight home. I never set foot back in those woods after that. I've gone hiking and fishing, even camped, but I didn't go hunting there again. About 2 months later, I moved down to a small industrial town in Alabama and took a job. I stayed away for 25 years. Years later, at the end of 2014, a relative died and left us a place down in Squatchy Valley, right near the mountain where I grew up. The sandstone cliffs were only a few miles from the porch, but I swore I'd never go back up on that face. Still, that wasn't the end of the story. The house I moved into sat on the edge of a 32-acre woodlot in a little community under the mountain. Lots of wildlife used those acres as a corridor between the mountain woods and the river bottom forests. My daughter lived nearby and had an old big dog named Buddy, a massive, sturdy hound that had squared off with coyotes more than once protecting his patch of ground. Within a week of moving in, Buddy and I were fast friends. He stopped showing aggression when I came home. He'd stop growling and wag his tail. But then, the odd behavior started. Some nights he'd get overwrought, barking and howling and angling toward the timber so loud I'd grab my rifle and go out looking. I'd never see a thing except Buddy, standing on the edge of the yard, barking and throwing a glance over his shoulder at me like he was checking I was there, then turning back to bark at the woods. I'd find nothing and eventually drag him back in to sleep on the rug. That went on for 3 weeks. One night he went into a real warning fit. I stepped outside and heard it, the same heavy, long strides moving away through the brush, heading back deeper into the timber. I swear my blood ran cold. I haven't heard those steps since that night, not once. Buddy had a few sleepless nights after, but the steps never returned in the way they used to. Over the years, I dug into local folklore and local accounts. What I found made me think this thing is some breed of Sasquatch or a foul-smelling ape-like creature. The reports always describe a huge, foul-smelling, bipedal, powerful animal. The one feature that sets these accounts apart from other aggressive Sasquatch stories is that distinctive whistled call, the jack whistle signature. To be honest, I can't say I ever actually saw it clearly myself. I know what I heard and what I lived through, but I never saw anything fully formed. All right, folks, hope you enjoyed those true scary accounts. Thanks for watching and for the comments. For those of you who tuned in to my latest podcast, I owe you all a huge thanks. It did really well. As of the time I'm recording this, it hit #3 on Spotify's top 10 and #6 on Apple, and it's still climbing. If you haven't listened yet, the episode's called Mysteries Declassified, and it's a preview of some new segments. There's a story about NY that left him speechless. He couldn't even come up with a believable lie for the panic he lived through. He spilled everything, even about Cuba and the plot behind it, begging for his life. Lucky for him, the revolutionaries didn't kill him. They shipped him out of Cuba a month later. Looking back, NY realized the plan was doomed from the start. It was badly conceived, easy to expose, and steeped in a kind of American arrogance. Who did they think they were, trying to play spy games on Castro's home turf? He had seized control of half the country, and more Cubans were switching over to his side. NY had never even shared a room with Castro. The whole operation was a disaster from start to finish. NY's screw-ups forced his superiors at the FBI and their partners at the CIA to take a step back. They suddenly understood that assassinating Fidel Castro would be far harder than anyone had imagined. Castro's government was young, sure, but Castro himself knew how to protect his life, and his inner circle was fiercely loyal. If anyone wanted that man dead, they would have to get creative. If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to help push this podcast to Hasson, go search for Mysteries Declassified Edited with Luke Lumen wherever you download podcasts, follow the show, and be ready for more jaw-dropping episodes coming both here and on our War Stories spin-off. You'll be shocked by the things governments get up to behind closed doors. But back to the Jack Whistle episode. I hadn't planned to talk about this one. A few weeks ago, I bumped into a guy, same tribe, same church, named Steve. He's from Tennessee, and when he told me that, something in me lit up. I asked him if he knew the Squatchy Valley story, because that's exactly where the fellow in the yarn had lived when he ran into the Bigfoot type things. Steve handed me something that looked telling, and I blinked. How did he know about Squatchy? Not everybody does. We talked. He didn't know I was working the story, so I approached him casual, tried not to give anything away. I just asked, what he thought about such creatures, whether he'd heard anything. He didn't dance around it. He said straight up, "Yeah, my granddad saw one." "Everybody around there knows the tale," Steve said. His grandfather had an incredible run-in. He wouldn't give me the details on the spot, just that he'd seen one decades back. I asked for his number and told him to write the story down for me. "I want to read it," I said. That's the draw of this work. You start a conversation with a stranger, find out he's from the same place, and little threads begin to knot together. It's fascinating. And in the end, it reminds you of one simple thing. I don't want to spend too much time alone in the woods at night.